summer, we've been doing little chats here in the garden all about the 19th century. We talk about the food of the 19th century. We've talked about the garden here. We talked about all sorts of the Treadwell summer house. But tonight, this is our last summer Thursday, we're taking a little bit of a detour. I'm going to talk to you about murder. Now, we have an old house. We do not have a dark and stormy night, which I am so glad about because I kept watching the weather all week long for this. And as far as we know, there has never been a murder committed here at 29 East 4th Street that we know about. However, the house has a past. Now, the Treadwell family that Anthony talked to you about, we know that they loved their house very much. And some people say that they never actually left, if anyone catches my drift. In fact, not so long ago, the New York Times referred to this house as Manhattan's most haunted house. Now, we could talk to you all about that later on. That is not what I'm specifically going to talk about in my little chat tonight, but we're happy to talk about that. We encourage you to come back in October. We do candlelit ghost tours of the house at night, and we tell you all the stories that you have to pry out of this to now. So, and most importantly about that, if you see something, say something, because we want to know what you've seen. Anyway, enough about that. Now, a little bit about the 19th century, because I am fascinated by the 19th century. When I came here to the house, I had a lot to learn. I knew about sections of New York, but as you all know, there's so much more that you can always learn, and it really is like a snowball that just gathers all this momentum. And one of the things that is extraordinary to me about the 19th century is the amount of change that happened in the 19th century. There was more change that happened politically, socially, economically, and culturally in the 19th century than at any other time in the history of civilization, which is really extraordinary when you think about that. Now, the population in New York at the beginning of the 18th century, there were 60,000 people that were living here. We just fought that war with England. We won, and 60,000 people were living here. In case you're wondering, that's about the population of Reno, Nevada, or Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. By the end of the century, the turn of the century, guess how many people were living here?
3.5 million.
3.5 million people who stole my notes. The reason there were 3.5 million people living here was because you had the consolidation of all the boroughs, number one, but also you had the waves and waves of immigration that came. So New York was pretty much a construction site throughout all of the 19th century, and a lot of things were changing. Now, this particular neighborhood, when the Treadwells lived in their house, was absolutely the most fashionable neighborhood you could live at in 1830. I always do that, I switch to 1830. In the 1830s and 1840s. As the century progressed, everybody started to move uptown. And this particular area was no longer the fashionable area, and crime started to creep in. Some of the immigrants in the Bowery out here really became Flophouse Row that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So there are many murders and crimes and mysteries that occurred steps away from this door. So what I'm going to talk to you about very briefly, and there's lots more research and we can talk about that later if you'd like to, I'm going to talk to you about 4 murders. 3 of which actually happened in the 19th century, one of which literally steps away from our front door, and none of those have ever been solved. And one is a series of murders that happened in the 1960s, not in New York, but we think pretty much the murderer was walking by our front door at the same time. So if you're all intrigued, we'll start. The first one I want to talk to you about is the murder of Mary Rogers. Now, Mary Rogers was a young woman that was born in the 1820s. She was born up in Connecticut. The records of her childhood have all been lost, but she moved to New York. And she was known as the beautiful cigar girl. You gotta get a gimmick, right? And we're gonna talk about that with some of these people. She started working downtown in a man named John Anderson in his tobacco shop. And according to the accounts of the period, she had a pretty face and a dainty figure. So she was basically luring men in to buy their tobacco products. Now, James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, all bought their tobacco products from this particular shop and from the soon-to-be infamous Mary Rogers. Well, one day in 1838, she just didn't come home to her mother. A suicide note was found, yet Mary herself turned up the next day. She'd been out visiting a friend in Brooklyn. Now the tabloids got a hold of this. Now one of the things about the 19th century that was important is you had the rise of tabloid journalism. You know, the newspapers changed from reporting things like, you know, how many oyster boats were in the harbor and how much fish had been imported. They changed to sensational stories and that rise of the tabloid journalism that, of course, we have today. So papers were not so much about what you needed to know, it was about what you wanted to know, and people couldn't wait to get the next installment of these war crimes. So anyway, the press got hold of the fact that Mary Rogers had disappeared. It turned out it was a hoax on the part of John Anderson to lure more people into his shop, because once Mary did return to the shop, people would come and they would see her. I think it's pretty faulty marketing, if you ask me. She continued to sell her cigars and lure men into the shop, but the story doesn't end there. 4 years later, in 1841, Mary left again. She left her lodgings to go to church and again go out to Brooklyn to visit a relative. I don't know what it is about going to Brooklyn to visit relatives, but be really careful. Her relative said there was a storm that night, and she actually never showed up at her relatives, nor did this particular relative say she even ever expected her. 3 days later, her body washed ashore over in Hoboken, and she had been killed. Who did it? They found finger marks on her throat, but there was no killer. So who killed Mary Rogers? Well, here are some of the possibilities. The tabloids, of course, went crazy. I'm sure it was a little bit of a slow July news-wise, but nonetheless. Now, it's also important to know that there was no real formal police force at this time in New York. Both formal police forces and formal fire departments came much later in the 19th century. These were gangs of watchmen, so how could possibly this girl be murdered and nobody saw it? One of the possibilities was it was the gangs of New York. You ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, right? Well, they were running all over at the time. So, gangs of New York, not sure. The fiance named Daniel Payne, who completely was overcome with grief at Mary's death. He was a prime suspect because he couldn't really provide a good alibi. One theory was that Edgar Allan Poe himself did her in. More about him in a minute. And another theory is that it was a result of a botched abortion, but that certainly doesn't explain the strangulation marks on her throat. So back to that boyfriend, Daniel. On the night of October 7th, 2 months after the murder, he went to a nearby tavern, drank himself to oblivion, swallowed some poison, and died on the very spot where Mary was found. What a drama queen. Was this an admission of guilt? Not sure. The story actually doesn't end there. The mystery is completely unsolved to this day. However, everybody's favorite 19th century literary addict, Edgar Allan Poe, chose to take this story and do a retelling of it, and he called it The Mystery of Marie Roget. And he set the story in Paris, and Marie Roget's body was found in the Seine. It was actually a sequel to a book that he wrote called The Murders in Rue Morgue, and literary critics say this was the very first time that a true crime had been used in detective fiction. So there's the birth of detective fiction right there. All right, Mary Rogers. Now, second one, a woman named Helen Jewett. Now, I really loved researching the murder of Helen Jewett because Helen Jewett was born in 1814 in Nowhere, Maine. I was born in Nowhere, Maine, but not in 1814. And I will tell you that is about where the similarity between me and Helen Jewett ends. Now, she was the daughter of a poor shoemaker, little town, and she knew she had to get out of there. So the first thing she did is she changed her name. She actually changed her name a number of times in the course of the story. When she was a young teenage girl, she got herself a job working for a man named Judge Nathaniel Weston. He was in the Maine Judicial Court. Problem was, things got a little hot and heavy between the judge and the teenage Helen Jewett, and she was discharged from service for improper behavior. Helen at this point decided that she was going to become a prostitute. You had to have a gimmick. She was known as the girl of the green eyes. She had beautiful green eyes, and she chose to wear green clothing because that was what she chose to do. She moved to Portland, and eventually she came down here to New York. Now, by this point in the 1830s, she was a well-established woman of ill repute at the brothel of Madame Rosina Townsend, which was downtown near City Hall. Now, because of the location of the brothel, her clients were lawyers, and they were judicial people. They were merchants. And one of her, now she was really more of a courtesan than an average garden variety prostitute. Poor Helen Jewett, whose actually real name was Dorcas Doyen. And when you're born named Dorcas Doyen, you gotta do something. You know, what's that line from Mame? You know, she says you gotta do something if you're born in Pittsburgh. Well, pretty much the same thing. One of her clients was this guy that she called Pretty Frank. Now, we can all worry about somebody that's called Pretty Frank, but nonetheless, his name was Frank Rivers, but that was a fake name. His real name was Richard Robinson. Now, he was a young, ambitious legal clerk, but his relationship with Helen really started to be a problem because you just couldn't be dating courtesans if you wanted to rise in the legal world. So, Dorcas, Helen, sends him a letter, and she says, "You know how I can love you, but don't let me show you how I can hate you." We've all written that letter, right? I know. His reply was, "Wait until I come on Saturday night and let's see if we can be better friends." I've written that letter too, but anyway. Sunday, April 10th, 1836, Madame Townsend is awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning. She hears a sound and she smells smoke. She goes into Helen's room. She finds the bedclothes on fire and Helen dead on the floor with a hatchet mark in her head. Now, they found the hatchet and they found the cloak that somebody supposedly had seen Richard Frank wearing when he killed Helen Dorcas. You got all that? All right? But he claimed his innocence. There was a trial, but there was just not enough evidence, and he was actually found not guilty. What's interesting about this trial is for the time, this trial got as much publicity as our current day trial of O.J. Simpson got. It was that big a deal in New York.
What
it
year
had
was
sex.
That?
What?
What year was that?
1836. It had sex, it had drama, and it had beautiful people. Now there's a formula for you. All right. One reporter claimed during the trial that he actually saw somebody slip a juror an envelope. Well, what did that mean? Richard Frank actually left New York after the trial. He went to Texas. He got some kind of fever and died 2 years later. He was 20 years old. And it is reported that on his deathbed, he uttered the name Helen Jewett. We'll see. All right. Number 3. This is the murder that did happen steps away from our front door, and it's the murder of Harvey Burdell. And this is one of the most notorious, and I'll tell you why, murders of the 19th century that is still yet unsolved. So by the 1850s, now we've moved out of the 30s and 20s and 30s and into the 1850s, and this area was starting to change dramatically as the development of Fifth Avenue happened in Central Park, and people were moving uptown. What was moving in here were tenements, multiple family dwellings. The wealthy were leaving. Some of the immigrants were moving over from the east side, and Bond Street, 2 streets down, was starting to look a little shabby. And it became the street known as the street of the dentists. Anybody a dentist? Because let me tell you that in the 1850s, being a dentist was not the wonderful profession it was today. All you had to know is how to pull a tooth, and you didn't need a license, and you could make a buck or two. Harvey Burdell was a dentist, and he owned a property, a townhouse at 31 Bond Street. And he rented a couple of floors of his residence to a woman named Emma Cunningham, who had a boarding house. Now, as you can imagine where this story is going, Emma and Harvey began an affair. Now, we know that Harvey was handsome, we know that he had some money, but he was a little loose with those morals. He was apparently sleeping with his 24-year-old niece, not a good idea. He was apparently treating many of the prostitutes from the Bowery for their dental needs, and they were paying him in kind, also not a very good idea. And he had started this affair with Emma. Well, what we also have discovered about Emma is that she was sleeping with a man named George Snodgrass, who was one of her tenants in the house. There was also a young man named John Eckel, who was playing around with one of Emma's daughters. This is revolving beds at 31 Bond Street. So, on the morning of January 30th, 1857, the boy who stoked the fire in the stoves for Burdell's office opened the door to find Harvey Burdell on the floor in a pool of blood. He'd been garroted and stabbed 15 times. It was a very bloody scene. Reporters rushed to the door, and the tabloids grabbed the story. Emma Cunningham was arrested, and she was taken off to the Tombs prison downtown, and eventually she was tried. She was acquitted. This was a very big deal because, first of all, this was the goriest murder that New York had seen, and second of all, you had a woman on trial. She also claimed after the trial that she was married to Burdell and that she was about to have his child, none of which could be proved, and this was all about the money that she stood to gain if she actually could prove these things. At Burdell's funeral, which was just up the street at Grace Church, 8,000 people turned out for that funeral. Talk about a media sensation, and it certainly was. The charges were eventually dropped against Emma. She moved to California, she moved back, she died. She is buried in Greenwood Cemetery, as is Harvey Burdell, and the irony is they are buried a couple of 100 yards apart from each other. Who killed Harvey Burdell? We have no idea. The last case that I'm going to talk to you about did not take place in New York, as I said at the beginning. However, it has New York connections. Now, I grew up in New England, and we knew this case very, very well. Maybe some of you will. It was the case of the Boston Strangler in the 1960s. The summer of 1962 was a very good year. It was probably a hot and sweaty summer. There was a series of 6 murders that took place. What was in common about the murders, they took place between June and they took place between middle of August. They were older women, they were strangled, and they had been strangled with their stockings that were tied in an elaborate bow. That was the sign of the killer. There were 7 more murders that were committed all the way up until 1964. January of 1964 was the last murder. There was a man named Albert DeSalvo, who was a former military man. He did have a record. He was already in prison for a series of murders that he committed in Maine, and he confessed. He said, "I am the Boston Strangler." However, something was not quite right, because at that particular time, you could actually make a great deal of money from any press that you received, any book deals that you got, if you confessed to a murder. So did he really do it? He was never convicted and tried by the police because they said there was not enough evidence against him, and he was already still in prison. 1973, DeSalvo is still in prison, and he decides he wants to talk. He says, "I want to bring the original psychiatrist that I talked to at the original case, and I am going to talk about the killings. I'm going to tell you some things you don't know." The morning of the meeting, the psychiatrist arrived at the prison, and DeSalvo had been murdered during the night. Now, there was a police commissioner. His name was Thomas Cavanaugh. He was actually the model for the character of Kojak, believe it or not, but he was. He worked on the original Boston Strangler case, and he believed that there was another man responsible for the murders, and that man's name was Charles Terry. And Terry lived in Greenwich Village and moved in 72 Bank Street on August 30th, 1962. Kavanaugh retired, and he really lobbied to reopen the case. He died in 1996 without reopening the case, but there are a number of researchers, people have looked back in this, they've matched Terry's profile with DeSalvo's, with the Boston Strangler, and there are a number of people that really believe that the real murderer of the Boston Strangler walked the very streets here in the village, and that we will never know. I hope I've scared you to death. Have another glass of wine. We can't wait for you to see the house, and most importantly, please come back and see us again. Thanks a lot.